All right, it is a little past 2 o'clock, so we'll start this webinar. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to my friends on the West Coast. I'm Ji-Heng Lee, the Senior Vice President at ACCT, and we're here to have the Hope Center for College, Community, and Justice do a little presentation for all of you on the real price of college, negative EFC, and policy. ACCT has been a long partner with the Hope Center on a number of items, and we want to thank Sarah Golder-Grab and Eddie Conroy for including ACCT as one of the partners on this project. And we look forward to seeing some of the policy implications and also some improvements for aid policy for our students, especially at our most vulnerable students at our community colleges. So it is my honor to introduce Eddie Conroy from the Hope Center to introduce our panelists, and we'll get this webinar started.
Thank you so much, Ji-Heng. It is a pleasure to be here, and it's been a pleasure working with ACCT on this project that it's been going for, was originally going to be going for just over a year, but the pandemic, as with so many of our plans, has changed a few things. So with me today, I'm very pleased to introduce Robert Kelchin, who's Associate Professor of Higher Education at Seton Hall University. Robert is one of our affiliates at the Hope Center and has been a key partner on this project looking at negative EFC. Robert's published a couple of different articles, including writing for NASFA around negative EFC and its implications and how it can potentially be used to provide better determinations of what financial need looks like for students. Also want to introduce Inez Lopez, who's the Executive Director of Student Financial Aid at El Paso Community College. El Paso Community College has been one of the partners on this project. So we had 6 institutional partners, and Inez has been a key leader for El Paso Community College in helping us think about these things, providing the data that we use to run these analyses. And so we're really grateful to Inez for being with us today. Wayne Talafiero, and I think I got pronounced it right, Wayne, but please correct me if I've gotten it wrong, is a strategy officer for student success in community college at Lumina Foundation, who have provided the funding for this project. So without them, we wouldn't be able to do this. And they've also been a key partner in helping us think about this work and helping make the work better as well. So we're grateful to Wayne for joining us. Last but very much not least, we have Mark Hulsman, who is a policy fellow here with us at the Hope Center for College, Community, and Justice. Formerly, Mark was at Demos, where he was an associate director for policy working on higher education issues. And then I'm Eddie Conroy. I'm the associate director of institutional transformation here at the Hope Center and one of the leads at the Hope Center on this work. So thank you again for joining us. I am going to just quickly drop in the chat one more time because I know some more people have come in, the link to the policy memo that is driving some of this, that's driving the conversation we're going to have today. So we released that just over a week ago. And how we're going to structure today is I'm going to just talk a little bit about this project broadly. Robert's going to talk a little bit about what we found in the negative EFC data that we put into the policy memo. And then we're going to have a discussion about sort of the implications about what this means from an institutional perspective, why this was important to Lumina to fund the work, how we can use this data to support students and think about supporting students on an institutional level. You'll see that there's a Q&A function. We're only going to sort of present for 10, 15 minutes tops, and then we want to engage in conversation with the panel. We want to answer your questions. So if you have a question that comes out of the presentation or out of some of the prepared questions that we have, then we would love for you to drop that into the Q&A for us so that we can answer those. So without further ado, I'm going to just talk a little bit about sort of what the project goals were and what we were looking at in this. So we we know that, financial aid estimates of things like need, cost of attendance, expected family contribution are often not super accurate compared to what students really experience. So we wanted to take some of the work that Robert had done previously on negative EFC and see how can we use that to provide institutions with better information about students' financial need. And also, could we provide institutions with the tools to do this work themselves? So as part of that policy memo you see on the webpage, there is a guide that Robert and I wrote together, as well as an Excel tool that Robert created of this is how you can do this work relatively simply if you want to make these calculations for students at individual campuses. We wanted to provide some practical suggestions for how negative EFC can be used at institutions and help, use this information to help improve policy. And right as we were working on this memo, the new Student Aid Index was released by the Department of Education, which includes a negative component. And so part of the memo discusses that and the implications longer term. So we asked some key questions. We wanted to know what students are most affected. How do students who have zero expected family contributions differ from those who don't? And then what generalizations can we make about students who have negative EFCs? And the data that we're talking about in this memo came from a little over 130,000 financial aid applicants from 6 institutions total, so 4 two-year institutions and then 2 4-year. The 4 years are broad access regional publics and all located in Texas. So Inez is here from El Paso Community College, which was one of the participants. The rest we discussed in the policy memo who were kind enough to join us in this work. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Robert for a few minutes to talk about what we found in the data that has informed this policy memo, and then we will go into the panel session. Robert, over to you.
All right. So right now, federal financial aid is distributed on what's called demonstrated need. And typically for need-based financial aid, it's based on the cost of attendance and expected family contribution. Now, come about 2023, we'll go from the term expected family contribution to the term student aid index, because what it really does more is it creates an index of how much the federal government thinks students and families can pay. Students interpret expected family contribution as how much they have to pay, which may very well not actually be the case. And then on the cost of attendance, that number is important because that is the maximum amount of financial aid that a student can receive. And it's not just tuition and fees, it's also books, supplies, travel, housing, it can be childcare allowances, the other non-tuition parts of going to college. And it's really important to have both of these metrics be as accurate as possible, so students can make good decisions about whether and where to go to college. And they can also figure out, how much am I going to have to pay for this college thing, and how can I do it? Next slide, please. So nationwide, something in the magnitude of 6 million students have a zero expected family contribution. And this is when you go through that complicated formula. For any of you who have ever done a hand calculation of expected family contribution, there can be a lot of numbers that get you to that zero, or it can be an automatic zero where if your family income is below a certain amount and you qualify for means tested benefits, you don't have to fill out the rest of the FAFSA and you automatically get the zero. So the challenge here is a third of American college students have an EFC of zero. And at many colleges, it can be a majority of students have an EFC of zero. This creates problems for colleges when they're allocating their scarce aid. How do they do that when so many of their students have both high need and the same apparent level of need? But the true EFC can actually be negative, because the current FAFSA trims some values back to negative. It can be if you have negative adjusted gross income, if you had a business or an investment loss. More commonly, if you have low income, the FAFSA has income protection allowances, and asset protection allowances. And if your income's below that level, you could have a negative EFC because the federal government doesn't think you have enough money to live on and go to college. So they put a negative, but then they truncate that back to 0. And I've written a few pieces about that that are mentioned here. But the key is that lots of students have this negative EFC, and colleges right now can't deal with how to tell the difference between students who are really, really needy from those who are really needy when resources are just so tight. Next slide, please. In our sample in Texas, most of the 8 applicants had negative EFCs. And this is common at community colleges, regional publics, institutions that serve large numbers of first-generation students from low-income families. And notably, students with dependents are most likely to have negative EFCs. That's because family incomes tend to be fairly low because it's hard to both work a full-time job and have a kid at the same time. And also, there are additional ways that the federal government does try to protect some income if you have dependents. And that also helps create a negative EFC. And then if you have a 0 EFC already, there's a pretty good chance you end up with a fairly large negative EFC if you're allowed to calculate the full number. Next slide, please. Yeah, these rates are high. At all 4 community colleges that we looked at, 70% or more of students who filed for financial aid had a negative EFC. And even at 4-year institutions, the rates were also quite high. And that indicates just the incredible amount of financial need that many of our current college students have. Next slide. And sometimes these numbers are really large. For students who are listed as dependents on tax returns, the median negative EFC was $10,000. Part of that is there's simply more opportunities to go negative because you have both the student and the parent section of the FAFSA. But independents, the median negative EFC was negative $4,000. And the policy proposal that ended up getting enacted is a student aid index, the new EFC term of negative 1,500 will now be calculated. So that helps, but these numbers are still larger. Next slide. And this really gets at the tip of the iceberg here, that with a negative EFC, you're getting a better sense of unmet need. That if you're truncating the EFC at 0, you think unmet need is less than it actually is. And if you allow the full negative EFC, you get a better picture of a family's full resources and a better picture of financial need. Next slide.
That is actually where we're
even better.
You're all done on your presenting, Robert. Thank you so much. And one thing I do want to highlight for our audience with this graphic, which is from the policy memo, is this unmet need is, and it's cited in the policy memo, that's the average net price that students attending public 2-year institutions, so community colleges generally, face. And net price and unmet need are, as we've talked about in the memo, sort of synonymous in this instance. So we've used that very deliberately in this context because we want to show what it's like for students who are, in this case, attending what are supposed to be our lowest cost institutions, that they already face significant unmet need. And we're showing with this work that actually we're hiding, 50% on top of that through the way EFCs are calculated. So let me stop sharing here and I'll ask my panel, they already did, to pop their video back on. I'm going to put mine back on. And we have a few questions and we're going to start out with Robert. I will say for all of our attendees, please do go ahead and start putting questions into the Q&A function so that we can answer those as they come in. Now, Robert, you have done work on negative EFC for several years. Where do you see potential for institutions to gather more data or use this type of data to more effectively help, in supporting students?
The best way to use the data is when funds are scarce like they are at most colleges, figuring out among that zero EFC pool, I mean, how do you triage your resources? And if you have negative EFC of negative 10,000 versus negative 2,000, if you have a limited amount of aid, you may want to consider giving it to the negative 10,000. And financial aid administrators have to make really tough choices. And to some extent, this helps that it gives you more information, but these are still really tough choices because you have nowhere near the resources that you need to meet demonstrated financial need. And what this can also help college presidents and leaders do is advocate for additional scholarships and grants, because you can show your community how much unmet need there is and hope that the broader community will help chip in to meet some of this need that you've shown exists.
That's really helpful. This sort of saying of we care about the things that we count and that we measure, I think is important here. That if we don't count what student need looks like correctly, then it's hard for us to go out and advocate for those things. And that's something that I think with as we're talking to trustees here in the sort of roles that you engage in, that piece about using this information as a way to advocate for more support for students, whether that's through philanthropy or through advocacy work with state legislatures and federal legislation, is a really key piece of how this kind of information can drive change. You can't use it, at least yet, to sort of apportion federal or state aid, but you can use it to show people what the realities look like for your students. Okay, Wayne, I'm going to come over to you next. And Lumina has been a really key partner in this work for us. Can you talk a little bit about why Lumina saw this work as important, why you funded it, and what benefits you see from this type of research, both for institutional practice and potentially policy as well?
Sure. So affordability has been a consistent priority for Lumina, especially given what we know about cost barriers and their outsized burdens by race and other dimensions. And then consequently, along those lines, we became more invested in understanding and addressing financial need over time, and doing so more pointedly and comprehensively, which in part meant getting at some of these core issues we were talking about earlier, right? Cost transparency, need determinations, and what that means for adequately resourcing students. And that EFC calculation really sits at that intersection in so many ways, both in terms of its implications across all three, but also in terms of what it means for gaining a more accurate measure of need and its implication for policy change. And so the Real Price of College project kind of presented an opportunity to model that, both in institutional practice, but also for broader policy case making and adoption, which we started to already see with this advent of the Student Aid Index that's forthcoming, but where we have an opportunity as a foundation to kind of connect those dots and incent some of that, and spur some changes where we wanted to make an investment.
It's really great. Thank you, Wayne. And that piece about institutional practice here, I think, is really key. And that's why, and as we wanted you to be part of this, because you've been with us on this work for a little over a year now. There's another few months to go on the project. And before we wrote this memo, we shared your individual institutional negative EFC data with you and all of the other project leads who've, a lot of financial aid directors who are part of this work. Can you talk a little bit about how you are using that information and how you're thinking about it as you go about your day-to-day work?
Sure. Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. So when we got the data, we knew there was flaws in the formula. There was gaps, and the data just proved it a little bit. What we had thought of, the data proved it. So what we're doing is, and me at my shop, and even with my counterpart at the University of Texas at El Paso, we're looking at reevaluating how we calculate the cost of attendance for students. We knew that dependent students, even though they're with parents, they might be the neediest students, but just because of how we have the indirect expenses, the cost that we haven't done a area needs analysis for cost of living in some time. So these students are not benefiting from additional funding, either state or federal or scholarships, because of what we have listed as our cost of attendance. So this data also helped us prioritize who are our neediest students. How do we get that exceptional need to the students that need it? With everything going on, and the formula for the FAFSA was 2 years back, but 2 years back, that family could have been, well off, very good to afford the college. And now, because of everything that has happened, that student back then was, didn't have the need, and now they could be one of our neediest students. So we're using a lot of the data to reevaluate, especially the cost of attendance, and looking at our indirect expenses, such as room, board, transportation, books, especially books, and technology. I mean, computers and all that for students.
Thank you, Inez. So one of the another piece of this project has been looking at cost of attendance for institutions. I know, Inez, that you mentioned to me in previous conversations that you were going to use this information to a certain extent, advocate for the need to do these things. Can you speak a little bit to that, of how having this data helps you go to your president or your board or whoever you need to speak to change things like cost of attendance calculations and say, like, we're not getting this right, I've got the data to say so. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Sure. So we usually use the budgets that are given to us by the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, which is the cost of living just increased by a certain percent. And I follow that. When I increase that, I notice the students that are being affected. So an independent with dependent has the highest need, they get the max, the cap of the max. So with this, I looked at my dependents and my independent with no dependents and saw there's a difference. It's a flaw there. So with this, my proposal to submit to our president and our cabinet is going to be, I need to justify it. Here's the data where it proves the students with a negative EFC, or those students that are needy, but we're missing out on them. We're missing out on giving them additional funding. So use that as support for, audits for the Department of Ed when they come by to say, I increased the indirect expenses because of this data, and the data proved it, it showed it, it's there. So with that, that gives me more of a flexibility to put probably those student budgets, not necessarily where they should be, but where they can be to help those students with a need.
It's really great. Thank you, Inez. And I think that that's a really, something that we have heard from not just Inez and people who have been, on the sort of project leads for this project, but other financial aid staff as we do different pieces of work at the Hope Center, that sometimes it's just about being able to go to your board or your president and say, look, I have the data to show we need to change our practice here. And that's certainly something we hope comes out of this work. So I'm going to change up our order a little bit. I have some pre-prepared questions, but we've got one that I think is nice in the chat. And that's from Oscar Valadares. And it's and actually, Jihang, if you're willing, I'd really love for you to weigh in on this one a little bit as well, of how can community colleges use college foundations to meet student needs? And I have a couple ideas, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this first.
Thanks, Eddie. I think one of the things that we always encourage our institutions to do is to utilize our foundations, especially in the last year or so. Our foundations have received enormous amount of resources from the community to support the needs of our students. I think the one thing to be cognizant of is to really kind of institutionalize the behavior of your financial aid office and your foundation so that you are providing additional resources to those students that have the most critical needs. And some of the information that Inez was talking about and was in the presentation, it really shows that even though we have Pell Grants, we have student loans, we have a plethora of other institutional aid-based, student aid-based programs, it's insufficient for some of our lowest income students. And hopefully our institutions and our foundations, institutional foundations, are backfilling these students. But Inez, do you want to talk a little bit about how you guys do some of your institutional foundation behavior?
Sure. So some of our, I mean, you know, we have a cap for all the population of students that we have, or the budgets. You know, we award for SurePal and the federal grants. We don't pre-package the federal direct loans. Students have to come in and request them, but we work very closely with our foundation office to see what resources or what funds available do they have for our students. We market them, we make sure that, you know, we have a deadline, but because it's usually March 15th or April 1st for scholarships, but because we have had additional SCOG or state funding, we have extended that deadline to try to make sure that we capture the neediest student. Now at our institution, the neediest student, or you know how it's defined, I guess it's how your institution or how everybody interprets what's a needy student or what's a student with exceptional high need. It could be a student with a 0 EFC up until a student that maybe gets Pell. So we try to cover with foundation monies or scholarship monies that are raised to cover, at least to have a little bit of buffer to cover those students, because a student with an EFC of maybe 5711 could potentially be a student with a high need that needs some sort of assistance from maybe even not federal funding, but maybe from monies from the foundation.
That's really great, Inez. The other thing that we have talked about, and I'm actually going to drop in the chat a link to a webinar that we ran last year that included Lizzie Moore, who's, I can't remember, I think either president or CEO of the Santa Monica Community College Foundation. And she talked a lot about how they have really worked with their financial aid office and other partners on campus to use not sort of negative EFC data in this case, but talk about things like, you know, basic needs insecurity amongst their students, which is connected to negative EFC. You know, we think that part of the reason we end up with so many students who have basic needs challenges, who are basic needs insecure, is because, as we've shown, we're not really recognizing what their full need looks like. We're sort of hiding a big piece of it. And that webinar was really useful in sort of thinking about ways that foundations can be leveraged to help raise funds for things like emergency aid programs and for additional scholarships and things like that. So I'd really encourage attendees who are interested in how foundations can support this kind of work to check that out. It was very informative. I've got a question from Mark, and then I'm going to come back. I see a couple of questions in the Q&A. So Mark, I'm going to come to you. Oh, hang on, I lost my questions. 1 second. There we go. So Mark, I think it's pretty fair to say we're seeing a vast number of new policy proposals around higher education funding and financial aid at the moment. I feel like every time I open up my news alerts, there's more stuff for me to read that I somehow don't have time to keep up with. What sort of potential impacts do you think a more nuanced understanding of student need could have on the policies that we're seeing sort of proposed and that are coming out, and the debates that will come from them? How do you see this information helping understanding in that policy debate?
Sure. Yeah. And in the time we've been sitting here, I'm sure that there have been 3 free new policy proposals, you know, that have come out. So I've got catch up to do, I'm sure, after this webinar, as do we all. So I'll answer that in a couple of ways. I think that, you know, in order to think about how something like negative EFC might impact the policy debate, I actually think it's important to broaden out the context in which proposals to, you know, either reform higher ed funding or financial aid or just address college affordability and debt, the context in which all of those things sit. And that's sort of that even prior to the pandemic, the kind of the story of the economy for decades, and certainly after the Great Recession, was one of rising inequality, of many families struggling to make ends meet, dealing with more cost burdens that didn't exist before, whether that's living costs or debts or childcare or the cost of college or wage stagnation, even as, you know, sort of top line economic figures told a different story and maybe gave a falsely rosy picture. And obviously the pandemic, you know, has accelerated these trends in so many ways, in particular for women and Black and brown workers and families with young children. And the reason I think it's important to mention that off the bat is that, you know, given sort of where we are economically, and certainly in the context of the pandemic, it's never really made sense to sort of truncate or lump families in together based on sort of one blunt assessment of need, right? We know that for example, Black and white families with very similar income and education levels have very different financial pictures, right? That's the legacy of the racial wealth gap. That's, having different opportunities to build wealth. That's different obligations that hold particularly families of color back. So, and given what we know about how the current recession has impacted families unequally, it really doesn't make sense now to truncate and lump, financial need into, sort of one, pretty crude measure. So I level set there because I think it's important that, if our corner of the world is financial aid and college affordability, for example, it's really important to understand what's underneath the iceberg, right? We can't expect to be fully successful in terms of allocating aid at the institutional level, at the state level, at the policy level, and reaching everyone who needs to be reached without just knowing the full picture of need off the bat, right? That's what folks have been talking about thus far. If we don't have a sense of the picture for students, who as Robert said, I believe, like don't have enough money to live on and also go to college. So for students, I think negative EFC or SAI or whatever we're calling it, moves us in a direction of first understanding there's a lot more need than meets the eye. There was already substantial unmet need for students, even at our lowest cost institutions, as Eddie, you mentioned, that even if Pell Grants currently cover tuition at some institutions or some portion of the cost of attendance, that there's substantial need in excess of that cost. So I think it helps build the case for more grant aid, whether that's need-based at the federal or state level, whether that's emergency aid programs, making current emergency aid programs permanent and more robust. So I think that there's just, it affects, the more we socialize the concept of negative EFC, the more that institutions are using it to sort of, advocate for the full picture of what their students are facing, that impacts policy, right? And then for institutions, we sort of talked a little bit about this, but there's a growing desire and kind of movement to kind of build equity funding into higher education, either at the state or federal level. And I think negative EFC and SAI, again, whatever we're calling it, can help ensure that institutions that are serving students with the greatest need aren't shortchanged, right? That we're not just sort of truncating it at the bottom and having a better sense of which institutions are serving not just Pell students or Pell eligible students, but a substantial portion of negative EFC students, especially if those institutions are getting 50 or 60 cents on the dollar of other schools in terms of state funding. Ideally that helps build the case for more state and federal funds to flow to those schools, right? So, I think that, negative EFC or negative SAI of $1,500 being allowed, allowing students to have aid in excess of the cost of attendance, is a good start for policy. But I think, sort of as you mentioned, that this can be used as an advocacy tool, both to sort of understand how maybe flawed cost of attendance figures sometimes are, but also just that there is more substantial need if our goal is to make sure that no one is barred from college for lack of financial opportunity, which is a pretty, bipartisan notion at this point.
Yeah, that's really great, Mark. One thing I think is worth highlighting out of lots of really good points in there is we talk in the memo a little bit about the need, the potential to use negative EFC as a way of better determining sort of funding formulas, particularly around performance funding. Something that there's some research that's starting to sort of trickle out on is the suggestion that institutions, and I don't think this applies quite in the same way to community colleges because they're open access, but there are some institutions who do what's sort of being called Pell creaming, where they enroll a lot of students who are at the very top of Pell Grant eligibility, who maybe only have a few $100s worth of Pell Grant eligibility. And it makes it look like they enroll a lot of Pell Grant students and are supporting them well. Whereas the reality is that a student who is eligible for a couple of $100s in Pell, who has an EFC of 6,000 or so, is probably a bit different from a student who has a 0 EFC, or as we've seen, likely actually has a negative EFC. And so, it's an initial suggestion, but we think there's potential there to do a better job of determining which institutions are actually serving the students who have the greatest need and are facing the greatest challenges at succeeding in college. Wayne, I want to come to you sort of for similar to what Mark was talking about, and then we've got a couple of questions in the chat that I'd love to come back to. But I'm interested, Wayne, since you're sort of sitting at a funder and you see different pieces of the policy conversation coming from different projects, are there places sort of different from Mark or things that you would want to add where you see value in this kind of information and these kind of proposals adding to the policy debate?
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, my answer is pretty much what Mark said, right? So, I think that, obviously this work, being able to enable institutions to better leverage their data, be able to better make informed decisions proactively around kind of how they resource students and think about need determinations is helpful. But the implications around policy are useful too. And that's obviously the larger goal here. When we think about what it means for not only that EFC calculation, but then also what that means for the case and the advocacy around things like Pell increases or expansion of or SNAP or childcare subsidies, right? And we've seen a lot of these conversations kind of get more traction in the past year, unfortunately due to a pandemic that shouldn't necessarily have to spark that, but that's become more mainstream and become more centered. And so I think from the broader lens, right, it's an opportunity for us to leverage this very specific lever to think about how do we expound upon a new concept and paradigm around aid and resourcing students across a number of different resource, federal and state resource opportunities.
That's really great. And something Wayne is speaking to here, I think is important because we talk about it, that this kind of information doesn't just have to sit within traditional financial aid. We know that financial aid by itself is, insufficient for what student need looks like. My background is financial aid before I joined the Hope Center, and I sort of commiserate often with folks like Inez who still are in financial aid offices of, but you're telling us these students have more need, but we don't have any more money to help them out. And I understand that reality all too well. But I think Wayne, you speaking to things like SNAP and other things, that this can also be a tool to identify on campuses who are the students who have the greatest need that maybe we can proactively reach out to with, hey, you might be eligible for SNAP benefits. Maybe if you're a parenting student, you're eligible for help from WIC, these kinds of things where it gives you another way of seeing who are the students who need the most support. And particularly at the moment, because with legislation recently passed, colleges are actually, the work requirements for SNAP have been waived for students for the next year, and colleges have been told you have to reach out to students and tell them they might be eligible. So now's a really good time to push on that work. So Inez, I'm going to come to you next because we've got a really nice question from Cindy Haney in the chat and I think that you're uniquely equipped to answer this. I see a lot of issues with donors wanting their scholarships to be last dollar. So the neediest of students are sometimes shut out of receiving other dollars to help cover unmet need. I'm wondering if that is something that you have found effective ways to address or ways to talk to donors, if you're working with your foundation, of how to sort of help them understand, these are the ways to think about scholarships so that you're helping the students who need the support the most.
Yes, the last dollar, that I think that's a challenge for all institutions, not, and it just depends on your cost as well, because if our cost is low, the last dollar, it really affects the students, the neediest students. It really takes a toll on anything else they have. Sometimes they'll say, well, you know what, once you explain to them what the last dollar is, they'll say, I'd rather not want that, and I want the other aid, because the last dollar then does, it pretty much blocks them from a lot of future aid that they could receive. For example, just recently, the reskilling program under Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, we were one of the institutions that got granted that money, and it was last dollar. Where we got it in the semester really had an effect because the semester had already started. So last dollar is first and everything. We had a whole conversation with the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board of, what were the challenges with that grant awarding it. So I reached out to them and I said, this is what is really hurting our students from receiving that. The money's great, it's there, we have the students, it's just the last dollar that is having a big effect on this grant. So next month we have a meeting with them to review how we interpret the last dollar, what it means to get that scholarship or that grant. So I would suggest maybe the institutions talk to the foundation, the donor, and sometimes they think last dollar because they want it first, not realizing, I think, that, a student is the need for Pell Grants, has a 0 EFC, has a negative EFC, but the last dollar is kind of a barrier. It's sometimes a blocker. Just that one little word could knock out a big population of students.
Yeah, I think a really, really important piece of what Inez is speaking to here is that sometimes there's a big piece of just being an educator towards philanthropy is a key role here of helping. Often people want to give last dollar scholarships because they think, well, I want to make sure that I'm helping those who still have need after they've already received X, Y, and Z. But that often is coming from people who don't always have a full understanding of the vast complexity that goes into financial aid regulation and policy, and how something that on the surface seems well-meaning can actually have a sort of detrimental effect at the end of the line. And that's, certainly something that was really valuable when I was working in financial aid, is we would have the financial aid office sort of cooperate with the foundation to explain these things, because this is the kind of stuff that it takes years and years to learn and fully understand when you work in a financial aid office. And it takes somebody sometimes with that level of sort of tech, somebody like Inez, who's been doing this for a long time with that very deep technical knowledge, to come in and explain to a donor or help them understand, like, this is why that's maybe not the best approach. I'm curious, Jihang, are there things that you're seeing amongst your membership of ways that people are approaching this as well, of encouraging donors or foundations to think more broadly and try and give more donor education here?
Yeah, I was just going to add, one of the areas that some of our colleges have now started embarking on is, we as a sector have large students who have dependents, student parents. So some of our institutions are actually creating programs for support for those that demographic of students, because we know they have critical needs. I really think, going back to what Inez says, it's like you just kind of have to boil this down to, like, who is the student body that we're trying to support. And Amarillo has Maria, who's their quintessential student. Creating like a student profile, I think, is very, very beneficial. A couple of my trustees who are on this call will remember, we had an annual meeting in San Francisco, and one of the things that the CCSF's foundation did is they actually created these mannequins with their student stories attached to them. So they had their face, and they pasted their face, and then they had a student story. And it really provides a powerful visual of, like, the students that you would be supporting through these grants. And sometimes, instead of saying, there should be a first dollar grant or a last dollar grant or all of that, just unrestricted power and funds to our institutions to support the broad array of students that appear in front of you, I think really does lend itself to a very powerful campaign. And that's something that I know a number of our institutions really took an interest in, because our students are diverse. They all have interesting stories, but how do you boil that down to a funder so that they can kind of see all the array of students that they need to be able to support through some type of philanthropy? And I think that's one of the hard pieces that we've been grappling with as a sector.
Yeah, I think there's some really key points in there. And I know, and I'm sure Inez would back up, that one of the favorite things you can say to a financial aid person is here's $50,000 in unrestricted dollars to give to the students you think have the greatest need. Okay, we've got some really good questions. We've got about 15 minutes left, so I'm gonna go to some in the Q&A. And Robert, I'm gonna start out with you on this next one. With President Biden proposing free community college, can you speak a little bit to the use of things like promise programs serving as a possible solution to eliminating or reducing family contribution needed for those students?
It all really depends on program design, and this is where first dollar or last dollar becomes really important. Will promise programs be willing to be first dollar? And Mark probably knows more about this than I do, but have we seen whether the Biden proposal's first dollar or last dollar yet?
It's first dollar.
Okay, it is. Okay,
yeah,
it is.
It's first dollar.
Well, then
Mark?
that could potentially help.
Yeah, Mark, do you want to add in there?
Yeah, I think that is key, right? And Robert's right. The program design is so key here, and what Inez was talking about, right? It can mean the difference between a student, having basically their full what we think of as currently unmet need met, and maybe some additional unmet need if we have negative EFC versus not getting any aid at all, right? I think that the hitch with the free community college is that it's first dollar. The president has talked about moving towards doubling Pell Grants, which I think those two things combined would get us would certainly meet unmet need for a good portion of students. I don't know the percentage off the top of my head, but very few of the major free college proposals, there's only one that I know of at the federal level, sponsored by Senator Brian Schatz, actually tries to tackle unmet need rather than just tuition costs, right? Most of them are tuition free in college, and there's political and other reasons for that, but just connecting it to the negative EFC conversation, right? If we're looking at allowing students to have aid in excess of the cost of attendance, cost of attendance for community college is obviously much broader than tuition and fees, right? So I don't think the free community college conversation ends, the discussion of how we allocate and provide more resources to students to fully meet unmet need. And I don't think it actually changes the utility of negative EFC either. I think it's really important to understand what people's need are as an excess of college attendance, whether or not tuition is taken care of.
Yeah, I would just say that, our association does support the America's College Promise proposal that's going through legislation right now, sponsored by Senator Baldwin and Representative Levin. The reality of, the situation is the average tuition in the local community college is around $3,600. In a low-income student who is a full Pell Grant student that's full-time, that's $3,600 that they don't have to use to tuition and fees, that they can use towards cost of living or just expenses of going to college, childcare. So while it doesn't necessarily address EFC and the additional cost for our students, it's still quite a bit of sum of money for many of our students into their wallet that they can use to continue and persist. And hopefully, those students that are half-time or three-quarter time, they can go full-time in pursuit of their higher education goals.
I think the other thing that I tack onto this is in my last incarnation, part of my job was to run communications for a financial aid office. And a big piece of this is also simplicity of messaging, which can be really important for bringing in first generation students, bringing in students from low income backgrounds, that every time I would go and do a high school presentation, it would be your cost of attendance or your tuition will be covered if you meet these 17 criteria, versus being able to, the person who now has that job is one of my former work study students. And I would love for her to be able to go into a high school and say, if you get in, then tuition is covered, and here are the supports that might be available to help with other costs. That's a much easier thing to talk about around a really complex issue, particularly for students who don't have the sort of social cultural capital that comes from parents who have attended college. Okay.
And I would, Eddie, the Hope Center has done a lot of work on the FAFSA, and so I have some with Robert, and I know Lumen has been interested in this. The reality of this conversation is, we're also talking about the fact that we still need, these low-income students and their families still need to fill out this arcane form. So,
yes,
even on a base level of, you'll get free tuition and fees is a monumental step in the positive, regardless of whether or not they need to fill out a FAFSA. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Jihang, I'm going to stay with you for a minute on this question, because it's, okay. And then probably I'd be interested to hear from other folks as well. It's from Alan Winston. It's what are the prospects in this Congress for the enactment of Biden administration proposals for free community college, increase in Pell Grant maximum, and funding for wraparound services such as childcare? What do we think the prospects look like?
So yes, so those are three priorities of our association. I'll start with free college. The Biden proposal, we have a strong expectation that if it passes, it has to pass this year during, and most likely through a budget reconciliation process that the administration and the Senate and the House would utilize. So I think there's a strong will to do it. Obviously the Senate is 50-50 with the tie breaking by the Vice President. So things can change in terms of the Pell Grant maximum and also childcare, those are typically appropriations process. The administration has in their budget asked for $400 max increase. And in the family plan that they also introduced with America's College Promise, they're looking for a $1,400 increase. So at face value, I think the administration has outlined that they would like $1,800. We'll have a sizable increase in the Pell Grant maximum. I don't necessarily know if we'll get 1,800. 1,800 is quite a bit. And then also in terms of childcare, we have continued to grow the appropriations for the C Campus program, which is a childcare means access to parents in schools. I am missing a word in there. But I think we strongly encourage our institutions to apply, especially as we come out of the pandemic. Our student parents need these facilities. Childcare was a really hard issue for many of our returning students. But there's a lot of money, and I believe June 1st is the deadline for our current C Campus application process. So for those of you who are interested, ping your offices and make sure that they apply for these funds.
That's really helpful, Jihang. Thank you. Wayne or Mark, is there anything you feel like adding to that? All right, Jihang, you did such a good job.
No, it would, and I do want to clarify that I think that the proposals moving forward around free community college, around expanding Pell, and what we've seen thus far in the through the various relief efforts and what's being proposed in the American Families Plan from President Biden would be a sea change for community colleges. And we're talking about the sort of total level of unmet need, and Eddie talked about sort of one of the reasons we think that there's a lot of basic needs insecurity on campus is because we've been hiding the ball on need for a while. But if we're talking about a really actually robust system of public safety net supports that sort of gets us in line with the rest of the world on childcare, on grant aid, on affordability, that really
I think
make a difference.
We're losing you a little, Mark, or maybe it's just my connection is poor. That's okay. This is the new wonderful world of Zoom. I want to highlight one thing there, and then we've got one more question. I'll come to you as well, Inez, of the piece about childcare, whether it's C Campus or if institutions are thinking other ways creatively about it. Particularly given all the evidence we've seen that this is a recession that has impacted women far more than it has impacted men. And we still know that women are primary caregivers, disproportionately compared to men. And we're also kind of seeing, as the recovery starts to happen a little bit, that women are not getting back into employment at the same rates as men as well. And one of the only ways that we're going to help, women either reskill if they've decided that going back to college is now the right thing for them, or get back into the workforce because they need a new certificate or credential or whatever, is by finding ways to support with childcare. And I know that's important for all parenting students. There are plenty of men who are single parents and things like that, but the disproportionate impact that this recession has had on women, I think, makes this really key. Inez, you wanted to add something, and then we've got, I think, time for one final question.
Yes, and really quick, just to chime in on the C Campus program. We have it. We got the grant. We got awarded. It's great. I would recommend anybody highly apply for it. It's a great program within our campus. We do have male single parents that benefit from our program. I think our parents that use it right now couldn't do without it. We have one person dedicated to it, of course, because it looks at financial need. So anytime something looks at financial need, it comes to me, to my office for financial aid. So yeah, anything it says financial aid, here, Inez, you got it. So and so, I mean, when we saw it, it was such an opportunity. We have childcare facilities, or now they call them learning centers within our campus, which is great. They're actually on campus. It helps students. I mean, the statements or the remarks that we get with students is they couldn't afford it, or they couldn't complete or start or their education without this program. I encourage everybody, do it. Reach out to somebody that could help you complete that application. Our grants office was such a help when we applied for the application. And it's great. The only thing, again, I go back to the looks at need, the cost of attendance. So sometimes if a student doesn't qualify, it's not because they didn't meet the academic standing. It's not because they don't have the EFC. It's because of that cost of attendance. Even though they're independent with dependents, sometimes, they have to get scholarships and other means. I mean, the TPEG and SUG, sometimes, they assume, oh, it's for their school. A lot of times they use that money to feed their families or pay daycare. So this campus program is such a great assistance for them.
That's really great, Inez. And I'm going to point, one thing out there. If you're figuring out sort of who on your campus might deserve a gift basket, your financial aid director, because so many things that we don't think of as financial aid responsibilities ultimately run through the financial aid office and often the directors, and things like C Campus, things like crime reporting for your campus. It would be amazing to some people, I think, to see the list of programs and responsibilities that actually run through the office of Inez and colleagues like her around the country. Okay, we've got one last question that we'll have to be brief on, and then we'll wrap up. And this is from somebody whose name is suspiciously familiar to me, Jesse O'Connell. And Inez, I'm going to start with you here. And Jesse's asking, how should institutions be thinking about the possibly large sums of unpaid rent, utilities, and other pandemic deferred costs that might be coming due, especially for, older adult students? So are you thinking about, ways that you can help with that? And then, I'll take maybe one other person wants to jump in before we wrap up.
Yes, so we are actually getting ready our proposal. We just completed our proposal under CARISA, or the CARES 2, or, it has like about 50 different names depending on who you talk to at the campus and what college or university. So now as a matter of fact, this morning, I got my second GAN letter, the grant award notification letter for the HERF 3 or AR.
Yes, HERF 3.
ARP, yeah. So, and that is great money, great funding for our institution. We have to be careful and wise on how we expend that money, but that's a population that we could possibly look at. And again, I go back to doing my, that's my goal for this coming year, to do the cost of living analysis to see where transportation, housing, just because, we had the COVID, some people did get assistance for rent and, housing, and there was different agencies within El Paso providing them some assistance. But just because they provided that assistance means that we forget about those students. We had literally students parked around campus benefiting from the Wi-Fi because they don't have that service or that technology at home. We had our food pantries that students needed food. And they weren't young students. They were maybe our older population students. So that is one thing we are looking at, teaming up with the local food pantry to help those, families, those students that need that assistance, but also the CARES, the CARISA, the ARP, that all that, that I'm hoping that that's where we target and help those populations.
Thank you, Inez. That's really great. And actually, the Hope Center has a guide for institutions of how they can think about utilizing HERF $1 through $3 that Mark has been furiously, and I and Carrie Welton on our policy team have been furiously rewriting this week. So that will hopefully be out in the next couple of days with revisions based on the latest round of guidance from the Department of Ed. So if that's something that folks in the webinar are interested in, we will hopefully have that out either by the end of this week or early next week. And I think with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ji Hang to close us out.
Yeah, Eddie, thanks so much. I would just make one note, and I know this falls in line with what the Hope Center wants also. We strongly encourage institutions to utilize their HERF funds, not just for Pell Grant students, that they utilize these funds to query their students if they have some of the needs that were outlined in the question. As many of you know, not a lot of our students fill out the FAFSA, and so therefore we do not know what their financial needs are. And since many of our students have multiple occupations and jobs while they go to school, they believe that that will allow them to go to college as opposed to filling out a need for financial aid. So we strongly encourage colleges to question their students, send out a survey if they might have an acute need that might arise soon, and help support those students. I want to thank everybody, Eddie and Mark from the Hope Center, Robert from Seton Hall, Wayne from Lumina, and Inez from our institution at El Paso. Thank you again for participating on this important subject. If you have any questions, please take a look at the brief, which posted. We'll also post this recording, and we'll also be emailing all the people who are registered for this event the PowerPoint presentation. Thank you again for joining us this afternoon, and it's great seeing you.
Thank you.